did. See, way back in 1906, when DeForest was losing his first company to...
I'll just interrupt this to say that we've got a stream back, I don't know for how long, and it's frequently dropping frames, so I don't know how long the stream's going to last on YouTube this week. It's highly unreliable. VK3AML, going back to the critique of Dr. Lee DeForest.
To a lawsuit to Fessenden, he became interested in borrowing someone else's detector that was based on a light bulb called a Fleming valve. After failing with a direct copy, DeForest made a new version of the Fleming valve by adding stray pieces of metal all over the place to make it his. In 1907, DeForest filed for a patent for something he called an audion that was a Fleming valve plus a zigzag of wire. That little wire ended up making all the difference, and the audion, that was renamed the triode or the vacuum tube, became one of the most important devices in the 20th century. However, DeForest wasn't the one to figure it out. How a college student named Howard Armstrong transformed the world with a jacked-up light bulb is next time on The Secret History of Electricity. Thanks for watching my video. Please remember to give it a nice thumbs up. If you're interested in Fessenden and how his electrolytic detector worked and how he created the first radio waves that transmitted sound, I have a video about that. If you are interested in the Pulson transmitter and how that worked, I have a video about that. And of course, check out the one about the vacuum tube. It's going to be a good one. Okay, have a good day.
Kathy Loves Physics, that's from her stream, a critique of the work of Dr. Lee DeForest, the inventor of the triode valve. DeForest appeared on a surprisingly small number of occasions that were recorded, but one of those occasions was in 1957, May 1957, when he appeared as the guest on, of all things, This Is Your Life. Two of his old compatriots came out of woodwork, including some that he hadn't seen then for about 50 years. Oh dear. And our streaming is unreliable again. It's going from excellent to 0 on about a 15-second rotation. Anyway, we'll try. If the stream fails, it fails. There's nothing much I can do. It's the same that we used last week. Frustrating. YouTube varies from moment to moment. Excellent one moment, poor the next. So, Dr. Lee DeForest appearing on This Is Your Life, 1957. And quite a bit of his background, more favourable than anything else, appears on this. We'll hear more about his less savoury activities later on. An interesting mix of angel and devil, Dr. Lee DeForest.
And now here he is, Mr. This Is Your Life himself, Ralph Edwards.
Good evening and welcome to This Is Your Life, everybody. I'm standing in our TV control room here in California, and here in my hand is the first radio tube, the miracle seed from which sprang the entire mighty structure of radio and television. Sonar, radar, talking pictures, guided missiles, automation, the electric brain computer, and long-distance telephone communication. This tube was the creation of one great man who at this moment is seated on our stage. Now, he did not hear or see our regular... He believes he's here to appear on a special program of events. Now, Bob Warren is ready to make this great man believe that we are just now switching this special program to California. So please cue Bob Warren.
You stay seated. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the television audience, I'm happy to introduce one of the greatest inventors who ever lived, Dr. Lee DeForest. You'll sit down, Dr. DeForest. Take a look at this television screen right here before you. We're going to take you now to New York City, and from there, a friend will speak to you, a man who, in his own garage in Montclair, New Jersey, perfected the cathode ray tube, which did so much to give us this miracle of television. Here is the chairman of the board of Dumont Television, Dr. Alan B. Dumont.
Hello, Dr. DeForest. I went to work for you as a young engineer in 1928. Together, you and I built the first television transmitter for simulcasting sight and sound. What inspiration you gave me, teaching me to search on and on that the answer could be found. You are a giant figure in our century. Your invention of the Audion tube opened the doors to the fabulous future world of radio, television, radar, and 100 other miracles. Had it not been for you, we could not see or speak to you, as I am now doing across the continent. I congratulate you, and I now wish to surprise you by having you meet your host, Ralph Edwards.
Hello, Dr. DeForest. Good to see you, sir.
Wonderful to see that picture of Alan.
I know. He came in live from New York just then. Thank you, Bob Warren. You know, I'm here to guest by now, Dr. DeForest, that to tell you, Dr. Lee DeForest, tonight, this is your life. I'm glad it makes you happy, sir. I assure you it thrills us. This is a night when we reveal a life of breathless excitement, when marvels happen for the first time in history. We'll begin that excitement in just a moment. Right now, sir, please sit down, take a breath. We'll be right with you. Now, Dr. Lee DeForest of Council Bluffs, Iowa, father of radio, grandfather of television. Let's follow your star of destiny, sir, back to its first light, shall we?
Yeah.
This is your life.
Wonderful, wonderful.
It's summertime in Council Bluffs, Iowa, 83 years ago. They had no such rockets as that one on our screen that we just saw now on the 4th of July that year. But that summer, you're born, a boy who will make such wonders commonplace. Your mother was Anna Robbins. Your father, descendant from DeForests, who came to America as early as 1636, wasn't it?
That's right.
Father was pastor of the First Congregational Church. When you're 6, he is called to a life of great dedication to direct a college for Negroes at Talladega, Alabama.
That's right.
Our parents took Lee and our brother Charles and myself to a strange new life in Alabama.
Well, now that's the first voice out of your past, sir. It's your sister. For years, you two have wanted to be reunited from St. Petersburg, Florida, wife of the Reverend Philip Ralph. Here's your sister, Mary.
I recognize your voice. Yeah.
How did Lee get along down there in the South, Mrs. Ralph?
Well, it was so near the close of the Civil War that there were still strong feelings among the Southerners.
Mm-hmm.
But, and sometimes they threw rocks at the damn Yankees. You remember how scared you were? Charles
I'm
was so
shocked to hear
scared.
you use that word.
Oh, it's a colloquialism. There's a play called that, you know.
They tried to open your shirts and find out whether you had blue bellies one time.
And, well, here's a fellow who can attest to that. Dr. Elisha Jones of Talladega, Alabama.
How are you, Elijah?
Finally, how are
I'm
you?
so glad to see you.
I'm glad to
Great
see you.
surprise.
I bring you greetings from Dr. Gray, the first Negro president of Talladega College.
Thank you very much.
You remember, Lee, I used to help you mow the lawn. You often sneaked off to the swimming hole. That rock that we used to use in jumping off into Talladega Creek is still there with your name engraved.
That, of course, was before you became a physician, Dr. Jones, right? Come on over here, Doctor, so we can get Mary in here, sister, too. As young as 10 or 12, you, Dr. DeForest, were constantly drawing or making mechanical things, weren't you, sir?
Oh, yes, indeed.
What'd you make? Model locomotives?
The locomotive that wouldn't move and the handcar that did move.
Yes, but all as you roam the beautiful woods and streams of Alabama, Your heart is set on being an inventor.
No, always.
Thank you, Mrs. Philip Ralph of St. Petersburg, Florida, Sister Mary, and Dr. Elisha Jones of Talladega, Alabama. You'll see your pal a little later. At 16, you put a respectful letter on your father's desk asking him to let you go to Sheffield Scientific School at Yale University.
That's right.
To earn your way in preparatory school, you worked in the fields, didn't you?
Yeah.
What'd you do there, sir?
At the school?
No, sir, in the fields. You planted potatoes, dug potatoes, and
Oh,
things like
in the school I had to dig potatoes. Yes, indeed.
What job did you get that summer at the World's Exposition in Chicago?
I was a chair pusher.
Little do you dream that 11 years later, at the World's Exposition in St. Louis, the name of Lee DeForest will blaze from the tallest towers there. Your beloved father dies while you're at Yale, creating even greater financial problems for you.
Yeah.
One night you worked late in the laboratory of Winchester Hall. In the same building, an important lecture is taking place. You remember this, don't you? The hall full of Yale professors and dignitaries. What did you do that got you into such a peck of trouble there, Dr. DeForest?
I was playing down and doing some experimental work down in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever I did blew the fuses in the building.
Yeah.
And the audience was in total blackness. They had to dismiss them by candlelight, and they dismissed me by daylight the next morning.
At 25, you win your Ph.D. degree. You've read everything about Marconi and his first device for wireless telegraphy.
3 miles.
Years of bleak poverty but blazing excitement pass. Now
Oh.
you're sending and receiving signals 7 miles, and then 20 miles, and then 100 miles.
That's right.
At the St. Louis World's Fair, Doc and I sent a message 300 miles.
A voice you haven't heard since the year 1906. Now, this is over 50 years ago. Here from Palm Harbor, Florida, is your wireless buddy, whom you haven't seen in 50 years, Mr. Harry Pop Athern.
How are you? Good.
Yes,
glad to see you again.
So was.
I'm so glad to know you're alive, boy.
There were some doubting Thomases among the officials at the St. Louis World's Fair, weren't there, Mr. Athern?
Yes, there were, but Doc convinced them, and Doc, they gave you the grand prize gold medal.
That's
The
right.
highest honor
That's
of
right.
the fair. And then in that same year, 1904, you thrilled the world again with history's first use of wireless in war.
That's
Yes.
right. And you were one of the men that did it. You were the one of the two that took the wireless telegraph to Hawaii
Yes.
and put it on the yacht.
The great English war reporter, Lionel James.
Yes, Lionel James.
Met you at that time. And what did you persuade him to do with your new wireless sets, Dr. DeForest?
Well, he happened to be on the ship that we were going back from Liverpool to New York.
Yes.
And Fessenden was on that ship, too. And my operator, Har Horton, was with me. We made it a point to be with Lionel James all the time so that Fessenden could not get to him. And we told him the story that what we could do for him in reporting
In covering the Russo-Japanese War.
Japanese War, where he was going over to do.
Well, you made that trip, Mr. Athern, so tell us the way Dr. DeForest wireless sets made more history.
I had a set on board a chartered steamer, and Admiral Togo's fleet was not far away searching for the Russians. We sighted the Russian fleet, and it said that in our messages to shore, the Japanese were able to find the Russians, and then Admiral Togo performed the classic maneuver of crossing the T and sank that Russian fleet.
Well, thank you, Mr. Harry Athern of Palm Harbor,
wonderful.
Florida. What a thrill to have made history's first world news scoop by wireless.
That's right. Really want to get it.
Today, the lean gray men of war of the U.S. Navy search the seas by radar, thanks to you, Dr. DeForest. Back as far as these years of 1902 to 1904, the Navy encourages you.
Yes, indeed. The Navy was my best friend from the very beginning. I was
I was with Dr. DeForest when he risked his life against yellow fever to set up the first Navy wireless stations in Cuba and Panama.
And I was present when Dr. DeForest invented the audion tube, the greatest invention in the era of electronics.
This, sir, from Paradise, California, is Mr. V.F. Greaves, whom you haven't seen in 15 years. And from Mineola, Long Island, your associate of many years, Mr. E.N. Pickerel.
So glad to see you, Pickerel.
Here in 1904, come on up, gentlemen, and stand by the doctor. Let's put him in the middle so we can really get him on. You know, we don't want to play any favorites here. They both are tremendously fond of you, of course. Here in 1904, the Panama Canal is being dug. What risks you and Dr. DeForest take in setting up those first historic wireless stations for the Navy, we'll find out in a moment, gentlemen. Back to This Is Your Life, Dr. Lee DeForest, one of history's greatest inventors, the father of radio and grandfather of television. Now, Mr. Greaves, I know you and Dr. DeForest went through great dangers there at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, building the first wireless stations for the Navy. What was it like there, sir?
To give you a faint idea, about 900 people were afflicted with yellow fever in Guantanamo Bay, and many of them died. But Dr. Doc's wireless station was completed in less than 1 year and sent a message over 2,000 miles, which startled the world.
Yes, it did. Both of you men are with Dr. DeForest the next exciting year, 1906, a year that men in future centuries will tie to the name of Lee DeForest.
And that was the year in which he invented the audion, otherwise known as the amplifying triode valve. This is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test transmission and an attempt to stream on the internet, but we're getting lots of dropouts. It's working very sluggishly, lots of lag. So best of luck to them. The numbers there, I know, are very much down as a result, but I'm hoping that the radio transmission is okay. You're listening to a May 1957 broadcast featuring the late Dr. Lee DeForest, about 3 years before he died. He not only was the inventor of the triode valve, but during the 1920s, the early 20s, he was the first person to commercialise talking pictures with an optical soundtrack on the film, which we'll come to a bit later. You will hear some of those soundtracks tonight. And at 11 p.m. we'll be opening up for our regular conversation on 147.475. So if anybody would like to come up at 11 p.m, about an hour from now. Back to This Is Your Life, Dr. Lee DeForest.
Why, Mr. Pickerel?
Because in that year, Dr. DeForest's great mind conceived the audion radio tube. And that summer, he was walking the streets, practically penniless, because of mismanagement by his financial backers. So he rented a small laboratory in the old Parker building on 4th Avenue in New York City.
One day, Doc brought a serious box. He connected it up to the wireless circuit and passed the headphones over to Mr. Burchard.
Well, what did Mr. Burchard say to you, Dr. DeForest, when he listened in?
He said, "My Lord, Doc, what have you got in that box?"
He was listening to those signals. In that mysterious box was the first three-element radio tube, the basic invention that was to rock the electrical world and give to mankind the miracles of radio and television. Thank you, Mr. V.F. Greaves of Paradise, California, and Mr. E.N. Pickerel of Mineola, New York, distinguished in your own right, Mr. Pickerel, as the first man to demonstrate radio from a plane in flight way back in 1910. Genius, they say, is 90% hard work. And here in 1906 and 1907, as always, you're working day and night, caring little how you live or eat, your mind aflame with your idea that wireless waves can be made to carry the human voice. You design and build your first crude carbon arc transmitter. And on a never-to-be-forgotten day of October 1907, you ask a young singer to come to your tiny laboratory. In great excitement, you show her a voice pickup phone, and you say, please try to sing through that.
I love you truly.
Yes, we found her. The first person in the world to have her voice broadcast by radio. From New York City, here is Madame Eugenia Farrar. There's your pal. You made the first broadcast in history, Mrs. Farrar. And who was the first radio announcer in history?
Dr. DeForest.
What?
He asked me to sing. And Mr. Edwards.
In announcing you to sing? He was the first announcer. That's right, he was, wasn't he?
And a little while after that, he played the records.
Yes.
So he also became the first disc jockey.
The first disc jockey. Someone heard your voices that great day, and here he is from Belmore, Long Island, former Navy wireless operator Oliver Wyckoff. Mr. Wyckoff.
Yes, wonderful surprise.
Now, where were you when you heard Madame Farrar's voice coming through your wireless set, Mr. Wyckoff?
I was a wireless operator on the Secretary of the Navy's yacht, the USS Dolphin, and we were entering New York Harbor at that time. When I heard the voice over the wireless, I was astonished and surprised, and I brought in some of the crew to listen to it.
What did you think had happened?
Well, I thought somebody had connected up a phonograph record or something to my set and was pulling a fast one on me.
I guess you really didn't realize that radio was being born that day.
Oh, yes, I didn't at that, no.
But it was, and thank you, Mr. Oliver Wyckoff and Madame Eugenia Farrar of New York City. You'll see Doctor a little later. In 1908, you marry Nora Blatch. And in 1909, to your joy, your first daughter, Harriet, is born.
Yes.
In 1910, you make history again from the Metropolitan Opera. What first did you score that year?
Broadcast the voice of Caruso.
First-
1910, from the roof of the Metropolitan Opera House.
First broadcast of Grand Opera. In 1912, almost by chance, you hook up two of your Audion tubes in series and discover that your tube is also an amplifier, the magic device which makes possible today all long-distance and overseas telephones, as well as every other instrument which amplifies sound.
And also an oscillator.
An oscillator?
An oscillator which became the parent of all today oscillator tubes.
Yes, sir.
Transmitter station.
1913 to 1923, you give your immense talents to an of yours, the talking movie. Now, that story deserves a half hour in itself. You tried to get every big producer in Hollywood to listen to you, didn't you, sir? But they turned you down. Yet you go on your own and are the first to make and distribute sound on film movies in 1923, years before Hollywood accepted it, and because of your pioneering, revolutionized the movies.
That's it.
1929, you turn your great mind to a new challenge, television. Your great accomplishments in television we've already covered with your friend Dr. Alan B. Dumont at the beginning of the program tonight. By 1930, your intervening marriage has ended unhappily. You think you'll never find lasting personal happiness until, through your cousin, actress Bibi Daniels, you meet film star Marie Moschini in California. All your life, you had written poetry. It seems that goes with great inventors. And to this lovely lady, you wrote these lines. Your loveliness defies my pen. Your face so fair, your voice so sweet, your eyes as full of love as when
you kissed me on a street in happy, sun-kissed Avalon. 'Tis poem enough to know that now and then you are my poem and
Yes.
my song.
Your bride then, your bride now. After 27 years, Mrs. DeForest. Come and sit down, please. That's a beautiful poem, Dr. DeForest. And I can see why now it was written. How proud you must be of your husband, Mrs. DeForest.
Yes, I feel privileged to have found in the world's greatest inventor the world's dearest man.
And here from Greenwich, Connecticut, from Santa Monica, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, sir. Can you stand 3 more surprises? Very dear to you, your 3 daughters, Harriet DeForest. Here's Harriet, all the way from Connecticut. And daughter Eleanor, Mrs. Frederick Peck. There's Eleanor. And daughter Marilyn, Mrs. Edward Coker. The whole gang. Your daughters decided not to take your many grandchildren out of school here at end of term. So, Dr. DeForest, here's a gallery of photographs. You sit there and look back here of your loving grandchildren now. You can see them back here. See the whole gang.
And I'll fade that out there. There's only so much schmaltz I can take before the sugar starts pouring out of the loudspeaker. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with a program on the work of Dr. Lee DeForest, and you heard him himself on Ralph Edwards' This Is Your Life, May 1957 there. In 1978, one of the first radio series I ever produced was a series of radio programs for the 50th anniversary of sound films in Australia, collectively known as The Coming of Sound, not very originally. And I had the opportunity in the late 70s, it being only 50 years from the inception of sound films, talkies, to meet and interview quite a few of the people who were involved. DeForest had studios all over the world at the peak of his sound film production in the mid-20s, including one in 1927, Australia's first sound film studios, which were rather eccentrically put into a tram shed, a disused tram shed at Rushcutters Bay in Sydney. And apart from the sound films, they also shot part of a talking picture feature there called The Romance of Runnymede. Now, in my series, I talked about earlier attempts at recording sound on films. One of the first, 1921, was in Germany. The whole idea was to take the output of an amplifier from a microphone and to feed that output to a modulated gas discharge tube, shine that through a slit onto continuously moving film, and you photographed effectively the sound waves in variable density emulsion. And that idea was developed by the German group Tri-Ergen, they called themselves, and by Lee DeForest in association with a very talented inventor named Theodore Case, who in the First World War had devised a photosensitive cell which had audio response speed. And by the way, I see that our drop frames on internet are increasing, so I hope people are still getting the gist of this via the stream. You can look up the stream by looking up VK3AML 19 June 2021, but it's flowing very slow this week and we're getting lots of dropouts, so I don't know what people are seeing. Hopefully the audio will be continuous even if the video isn't. Anyway, over to my program on the early, I suppose you'd call it prehistory of sound film in Australia, to that time when DeForest was extending his experimental sound film activities to Australia, and we managed to locate the very elderly Arthur Hanson, then in his 90s, in 1978, who was willing to talk to us about the work of DeForest in Rushcutters Bay back in 27.
Good evening and welcome to This Is Your Life, everybody.
Oh dear, Miss Q. There's the first.
But all of the disc and cylinder record systems had two inherent faults. The record could get out of synchronization with the action on the screen, and the early gramophones were not loud enough to fill an auditorium with sound at reasonable volume. By 1918, a German company, Triagon, was experimenting with recording sound on the motion picture film itself. And by 1921, they produced a short demonstration sound film called A Day on the Farm. Other experimenters were using the sound on film process. The most important was Dr. Lee de Forest, the inventor of the triode valve, the first practical electronic sound amplifier. In loose collaboration with Theodore Case, de Forest made a series of sound film tests. In this 1922 experiment, Case is speaking into the microphone while squinting into the camera.
The camera's about up to speed now. We're taking this at about 80 feet a minute. Here's a test word that I want to try. Cheese crisp. Cheese crisp. All right, EI, you can shut the thing off now. Yeah, shut it off. EI, will you please shut the camera off?
I'll try blowing a little, see how that sounds, shall I? All right. How's that? Can you feel the air? I'd like to know whether you can feel the air coming to you. You people that are sitting there and watching this picture. Kush, can you feel it? Can you, EI? I see. Now the amplification on this number 5 microphone is, gee whittakers, those lights are awfully bright, EI.
The sound quality was improving daily. By April 1923, de Forest had set up his studios in New York, where a series of short sound films were made in preparation for the invention's public debut. Among the items shown at the premiere was a string quartet playing an accompaniment for the dancer Lillian Powell. Here it was at last, the answer to the talking picture problem. Sound photographed on the film itself with no separate recording. Virtually the same system that we use today. The public and press were delighted, and the demand for the phonofilms steadily grew. But the film producers and directors who could really push the invention had huge stocks of silent films that were making a lot of money, and they didn't see the point of going to the trouble of making sound films. Pointing to the failure of the Edison kinetophone, they continued to ignore the early sound film experiments. But Lee de Forest was convinced that there was a future for the sound film. He signed a small number of independently owned theatres to contracts with his company and produced films like this one of Phil Baker, the accordion-playing comedian.
Indian love call from Rosemarie. I wrote Rosemarie, but she never answered me. Is there any other selection you'd like to hear? Go home. Oh, pardon me. What'll I do? Well, I'll try it again. What'll I do? What'll I do? You know any more good songs? Tango song. Yes, sir. Not it. Why don't you go home? Now, please stop annoying me. I have a brand new song here, hot off the griddle. Talk about your lady drivers. I met one uptown. Someone give her a brand new sliver and you can't hold her down. His Christian name is Henry, but she called it her sedan. Doggone thing rattles like an old tomato can. Oh, you ought to see Ann in a little sedan. She likes to come up near and bump you in the rear with a wheel in her hand. She's an awful brigand. All those who ride in Annie's Ford put their feet in the car and the trust in the Lord. One night she went riding with Dan. She hit a tree and then the fun began. Who did they find up in the trees? He's hanging by her XYZZ's hand. But you ought to see Dan. Oh, man.
Pardon me, is there a Mr. Browning in the house? Mr. Browning? He checked his Chevrolet in the coat room. It's leaking all over the place. Thank you.
Meanwhile, a Sydney company was embarking on the most lavish silent film production ever to be attempted in Australia, an adaptation of Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life. In 1926, Australasian Films Proprietary Limited brought American director Norman Dorn to Australia to supervise the production. Money was no object. But what were the real motives behind the production? Arthur Hanson was a laboratory assistant working on the film.
To me, it was a sort of a trick on the part of the overseas monopolies, because they really didn't want us to make films and disturb their situation. I do feel that they expended so much money on making this film that it was an indication to the public that you may as well forget about making films in Australia. I think even you'll see in the literature that you read that it has had this tendency to try and squash the industry here, because after all their bread and butter was from the overseas product. Every year we would be given a sort of a come on, that things are going to really be good next year, and then they're going to be good next year. And so it went on like a teaser right through all the years that we battled there, hoping that one day there was going to be something doing. I can only remember that I was at Bondi Junction there, and there was a fantastic amount of sets being built. It was quite mysterious to realise how much money was being spent on the extravagance of this film, apart from all their country locations, Tasmania and all around New South Wales. They had the whole studio packed tight with sets. It was unbelievable. You'd see the actors going up there for lunch to Bondi Junction in their old crinolines, and the men in their prison garb, and they're going up to buy a pie up at the junction. And there was a terrific amount of people involved in it. So when that phase passed over, it sort of flattened out again. Nothing happened for quite a while after that.
Innocent yet taking all the blame. shame and the love of an innocent maid helped him bear all this sorrow and strife. For the sake of another, he sheltered another for the term of his natural life.
The Terms producer, Norman Dawn, told the story of a man who approached him offering to record sound for the film.
While we're on location in Tasmania, I was approached by a Mr. Whitney, who had a device for recording dialogue on steel wire, a forerunner of the tape recorder, and then playing it back. On several occasions, I had him record some scenes, and I listened to them. They were faithful reproductions of the dialogue. Of course, he hadn't worked out a means of synchronizing them with the motion picture. I think, in looking back, that it was possibly an impractical approach to the talking picture, which was then on the way.
And talking pictures were certainly on the way by the start of 1927. As early as 1925, New Zealand film exhibitor William P. Kirkwood brought a DeForest phonofilm projector to Sydney. At 8 a.m. on July the 6th, 1925, before a gathering of pressmen and investors at Sydney's Piccadilly Theatre, Kirkwood gave the first demonstration of sound on film in Australia.
A half-hour program of short phonofilms was presented, and the synchronization of sight and sound seemed to be infallible. The gramophone effect at the present time is inconsistent in quality, but this will be remedied in due course.
In September of 1925, DeForest Phonofilm Australia Limited was floated as Australia's first sound film company. A series of demonstrations followed, and the organisation caused a stir in the local film world. There was a typically Australian reaction from our silent film producers.
The talking film is in its absolute infancy, and no matter how perfect it may become, it will never, to our mind, be anything but a novelty. The idea that drama could be more effectively put over by the talking film is absurd.
The technical excellence of the DeForest demonstrations impressed the public, but all of the films were imported and suffered from the American accent. Perhaps it would be better to show locally produced phonofilms. The answer was simple. In December 1926, DeForest Phonofilm Australia Limited amalgamated with a Sydney film production company, Sovereign Pictures, with Stanley Hawkins as managing director. Arthur Hanson is the only surviving staff member of the Australian branch of DeForest Phonofilms.
They brought a terrible lot of gear over here. In addition to laboratory gear, they brought over their theatre gear. And the man who came over with that was Harry Jones. He installed the gear in the Lyceum, I think it was. And they ran films there, actual sound films, long before there was any sign of the jazz singer or any of those coming out. There's not many people in Australia that realised that they were first to hit the screen with sound. But it was so good that on the end of each film that was shown, they had a tag title to say, would you like to see or hear more phonofilms? And they were very well received by the public.
cameraman Roy Driver was in the audience at a screening of DeForest phono films in Melbourne in 1927.
Well, I first saw it at the Majestic Theatre in Flinders Street. I was very intrigued with it. As far as the quality is concerned, I think that being a sound film was fascinating, and that was it. They had no sound gates in the projector, of course. It was just put on the standard projector, and you could see the variable density soundtrack running down the side of the picture image on the screen. But it was very intriguing in those days because we were only used to films with titles. We had a cameraman here who'd been brought out from Pathé in France when they set up Pathé Friars in Melbourne in 1908. And Maurice Bertel said to me at that stage, being young, I was all enthusiastic about it, it's only a passing fad, it can't possibly stay. You just concentrate on your camera work and your editing, and that's the main thing.
Everybody, hello! Married men are smiling like they never smiled before. When you sing of home, sweet home, they don't cry anymore. I asked a chap to tell me what this change about. He winked his eye and heaved a sigh, and then began to shout, hooray for the radio, hooray, hooray, hooray. The man that made the radio made me what I am today. No more I'll ever have to take my shoes off in the hall, for how can wifey hear me with her ears out in St. Paul? Hooray for the radio, hooray, hooray, hooray. The man that made the radio made me what I am today. I know my wifey wouldn't miss me even if it poured. As sure as Ailey, Ailey won't be sung by Henry Ford. Hooray for the radio, hooray, hooray, hooray.
Frank White and Frank Bessinger in a DeForest phono film shown during demonstrations in Melbourne in 1927. Even more impressive was the first sound film drama brought to Australia. The Antidote was produced in DeForest's London studios in April 1927. By June, it was shown in the Australian demonstrations of the company. The acting was pure corn, and the voices were sometimes mixed with the grinding motors of the converted silent film cameras. But the film had more spoken dialogue than the famous Al Jolson film The Jazz Singer, and preceded it in Australia by nearly 2 years.
Marion, I've just trapped a wonderful specimen.
How splendid!
A python, 26 feet long. I'm hoping this capture will conclude my experiments.
I hope so, dear. I do so loathe this atmosphere of snakes. Aren't you going to catch 'em this evening?
No, I've decided to go tomorrow.
But if you don't go...
I'm too tired. Has anyone called?
No, dear. Only the boy looked in to say the pony was ready and to remind you about the cobra.
Oh, yes. I think he's ready for some attention by now.
Be careful, dear.
Ah, you beast! Marion!
Oh, what is it, Gilbert?
The cobra has struck me.
Oh, Gilbert!
Now, don't fuss. Pour a little of this into the wound and bind it with your handkerchief.
Are you sure this antidote will kill the poison?
It's cured me of a dozen snake bites. 3 years close study, my dear, is well repaid by it.
DeForest phono films imported sound film cameras to make demonstration films of local activities. But when they tried to make sound films of the Duke of York opening the first federal parliament in Canberra, they came up against government red tape and the self-interest of American-owned distribution companies. As Arthur Hanson recalls, the result was only partially successful.
Wally Sully took the gear up there and they couldn't get close enough. They were only allowed to get within about 50 or 60 feet of the Duke, and it was no good for sound. They were going to record over landline. Well, the recorder was down in Bathurst Street, and Wally was shooting wild up there. I don't think he took the sound gear, and he only shot a fraction of picture. You know, he ran out about 25 feet or something like that, and he ran out of film. And the sound was still recording down in Sydney there with the Duke, standing at the dais. And So Len Jordan made a loop out of the picture, kept the loop going for about 10 times. I suppose there was 100 feet or 5 feet of picture, and no cutaways or anything like that. But during the speech, the Duke was going on with brushing flies off his face, and then there was he brushed the same action repeated there for 6 or 7 times, and people in the theatre started to get all restless. And so I think this was a very sad thing that happened, being such a very important item.
And the Duke in Canberra opening the first federal parliament, May 1927, the subject of one of the first sound films made in Australia. The Duke, of course, had a bad speech impediment. He stuttered. So in spite of their attempts to estimate how long the speech would be, it took twice as long. Hence, their picture image negative ran out a lot sooner than their sound recorder did. Funny to hear also on that recording how much my voice has changed in 43 years. That was recorded in 1978. And we'll go back to the last of that. This is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test, dealing at this stage with the start of sound films in Australia. I recorded that interview with that last employee of Sydney DeForest Phono Films, somewhere near Gosford. I think it was Whale Beach. I went up there with another film researcher, Graham Shirley, and recorded jointly an oral history with Arthur Hanson that day. Arthur was, I think, in his 90s by that time, which means he would have been born, 1880s. Quite something to think about. I was 24 at the time. Anyway, back to the documentary The Coming of Sound.
The DeForest Company in Sydney found itself in financial difficulties. Arthur Hanson remembers that some of the trouble started when the American sound man Harry Jones returned to the United States.
Well, it appears that when Harry Jones was handling the setup here with all the gear, he had it running perfect, especially in the theatre where the public were able to pass their opinion of it. And then as soon as he went back to America, it seemed that they just could not get someone to replace him in the maintenance side of it. And projectionists were not experienced either. And so the whole thing deteriorated because I think in one particular part of it, we'll say, for instance, the battery, there was a terrific amount of batteries involved in it. And it could have been that the maintenance on just one part of it there was the cause of the failure. But that's where the tragedy was, that sound on film had been exhibited in Sydney long before the Warner Brothers came to light.
DeForest had adequate capital, the right equipment and trained staff. They'd started producing short dramatic films, which they were offering at a much cheaper rate than comparable imports. But the American-owned distribution companies just wouldn't touch the local product. Following a tour of New South Wales country towns, the DeForest Company gave its last demonstrations in Brisbane in March 1928, after which it ceased active operations in Australia. Of the dozens of sound films that they demonstrated in Australia, only a handful of the imported items are known to have survived. But in its few short months of production, DeForest Phono Films Australia Limited blazed the trail for the commercial arrival of the sound film in Australia.
And we'll fade that out. That was me 43 years ago, and a bit of Harry Jacobs' orchestra from the Palais Picture Theatre in St Kilda at the closing there. This is VK3AML testing, and we're playing various tracks related to Dr. Lee DeForest and his promotion of early sound films. One of the chief early members of DeForest's crew was a prominent scientist of that period, Theodore W. Case. Case was an immensely rich man who lived in upstate New York, a place called Auburn, up near Niagara Falls. And in his family home, an immense family home, which has now been turned over to the American equivalent of the National Trust and has become the Cayuga Museum, he had a studio that he fitted up for experimental talking pictures. He devised during the First World War a very high-speed photoresistive cell called a thalified cell. Active ingredient was thallium oxysulfide, a very early form of photoresistive semiconductor with an audio response so that it could play back optical soundtracks off film fairly easily. It was originally devised actually as an infrared detector for a speech on light beam, an infrared light beam system that was developed, would you believe, during World War I. And a lot of Theodore Case's papers have been the basis of my own and Dr. Mike Groth, VK3AML's work on modulated light beam linking. It still is optically appropriate at a distance of 100 years. So here's a little bit of Theodore Case experimenting with his associate Earl I. Sponable. You can hear him saying, "Turn the camera off, EI," at one stage. This is a test from 1922 with Theodore W. Case speaking, recorded on film.
Were not loud enough.
The camera's about up to speed now. We're taking this at about 80 feet a minute. I'll read a little from the Lincoln speech. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Now, here is a test word that I want to try. Cheese crisp. Cheese crisp. All right, EI, you can shut the thing off now. Yeah, shut it off. EI, will you please shut the camera off?
All right. A test with Theodore Case, a very brilliant engineer, and he teamed with DeForest on making those phonofilm shorts in the early 1920s. One of the first prominent people that they recorded on the phonofilms was the well-known Jewish comedian Eddie Cantor, very young in those days. This was the first time that Cantor had appeared on a sound film. It was recorded in December 1922, which makes it an incredibly early piece of optical sound. At that time, he was appearing a few blocks away from DeForest's studio in a musical called Kid Boots, which was subsequently made into a silent film with him and Clara Bow. But this is Cantor in his first experimental sound film for DeForest.
Hello? Oh, no, lady. No, you're wrong. I'm not Tommy Meehan. Funny how everybody takes me for Tommy Meehan. No, Tommy hasn't got that certain that I have. But it's a funny thing. For a man that's good looking as I am, I get the homeliest girls. I just canceled a girl of mine, yes. Homely? Oh, you've heard about people's faces being wrinkled? Hers was a court edict. And she had a very, very nice family. Of course, they had a lot of hard luck. Yes, her poor father, he died of throat trouble. They hung him. And her brother, lovely chap, but he's gone, poor fella. With good behavior, he ought to be out in 1927 or 8. He used to work in a bank. But no matter how much the boss likes you, you can't work in a bank and bring home samples. Oh, no. And she was a nice girl. I didn't mind her being homely, but she was so dumb, terribly dumb. Well, she was so dumb, they had to burn down the schoolhouse to get her out of the 2nd grade. Can't beat that. Well, enough about her. I think I'll recite. That's it. I feel poetical. There was a man who loved the bees. He was their earnest friend. He used to sit upon their hives, but they stung him in the end. Thank you. I knew you'd like it. Oh, before I forget, yesterday I went down to the Pennsylvania Railroad station to wait for a train from Philadelphia. And standing alongside of me, right in a little place where you make the trains for Philadelphia, was a Jewish man and a little boy. And it seems that this boy must have aggravated his father because his father kept hitting him. He kept saying to him, "I could give it to you for the 2nd time." Finally, a man passed and said, "Cut it out, mister. Don't you hit that boy again or I'll make trouble for you. Hear that? I'll make trouble for you." This fellow turned around and said, "You're going to make trouble for me. Last week, my wife ran away with the janitor. Yesterday, I failed in business. My baby's got measles, and he swallowed the tickets to Philadelphia, and you're going to make trouble for me?" You seem to like this story so well, I think I'll tell you another story of a gentleman of Hebraic faith. Last year, the week before Christmas, you remember we had the week before Christmas last year, I was going on the train from Chicago to San Francisco on the Overland Limited. That's an express train that goes directly from Chicago to San Francisco. And the first day out, seated alongside of me, was this little fella, kept moaning to himself like this. And the next day out, he repeated the same thing. He says, basement. And when he did it the 3rd day, I went over to him. I said, "Mister, please excuse me for butting in, but I want to help you. Tell me why. Why do you keep moaning like that?" He says, "Oh, it's already the 3rd day I'm on the wrong train. Well, I think I'll sing again now. Won't hurt. Mr. Olson, again, won't you play a little something for Eddie?" Georgie Porgy is a guy who is very bashful and so shy. The ladies prize him. They idolize him. You can find him most anywhere in a great big cozy Morris chair, idly looking at the ceiling while some girlie is appealing. "Oh, gee, Georgie, whenever I'm with you. Oh, gee, Georgie."
Eddie Cantor in an experimental sound film made in December 1922 by Dr. Lee DeForest. One of the earliest films made by DeForest with sound, and was used at the premiere of the system in 1923. Another major advance that was made by DeForest with Theodore Case was an attempt to make the first sound newsreel. This came about in August 1924 when the American elections were on. On one side, the existing president, Calvin Coolidge, very much a laissez-faire man. On the other side, the radical, Robert La Follette. La Follette gives a rather disjointed speech to the sound film camera in this, the very first sound newsreel, if the truth be known, recorded in front of the White House.
It's in the making. It has today to meet an impending crisis, menacing as any in the nation's history. It does not call a sound to arms, but it is nonetheless a call to patriotism and to higher ideals in citizenship. The patriotic citizenship of the country must take its stand and demand of wealth that it shall conduct its business lawfully, that it shall no longer furnish the most flagrant examples of persistent violation of statutes while invoking the protection of the courts.
On the other side of the political coin was Calvin Coolidge.
The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that there is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price, to pay his taxes. The manufacturer, the professional man, the clerk must do the same from their income. The wage earner, often at a higher rate when compared with his earning, makes his contribution, perhaps not directly, but indirectly, in the advanced cost of everything he buys. The expenses of the government reach everybody.
Calvin Coolidge, the President of the United States, getting re-elected in August 1924. The first presidential speech to be recorded on a sound film, August 1924. There's also a radio sketch filmed by De Forest at this time, which gives you a fair idea of how radio operated in its very earliest days. This is also recorded in 1924, again with Phil Baker, the accordion-playing comedian, and we see him wearing a full-dress suit in a studio, a radio studio that hung with drapes around the walls to suppress echo, which was thought to be desirable at the time, and playing records not with an electric pickup but with a mechanical gramophone and a carbon microphone in front of it. Like this.
Station BUNK-SAP announcing. You have just heard the Sears Roebuck Symphony Orchestra play a brand new selection entitled Many a Happy Home Has Been Broken Up by an Idle Rumor. Tonight we are broadcasting directly from the Gold Room of the Automat. The Sears Roebuck Symphony Orchestra of 75 selected musicians play here every afternoon at 2 a.m. by courtesy of the Fulton Fish Market. We will be delighted to receive any telegrams from our listeners out telling us how much they like our program. Any telegrams except those sent collect. We're no fools.
Telegram for RUA staff.
That's me.
You looking?
Oh, here. 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 Hear what I have to say. Get out. We have received 50 or 60 telegrams. The first one reads as follows. My dear Mr. Sapp, we are listening in and want you to know that we are with you to the last man. Daughters of the American Revolution. I want to thank the daughters for their cute little telegram. The next number on the program, I take great pleasure in introducing Professor Pizzicato, a French violinist from the other side of Jersey City. Mr. Pizzicato. Parlez-vous français?
Chevrolet Coupe.
So is your old man. You have music, yes, no? Ah, Mr. Pizzicato's first selection will be the quartet from A.B.'s Irish Rose. He is a little nervous, this being his first appearance in front of the microphone, and he's breaking in a new suit for the occasion. He paid $90 for the suit. Got 9 pair of pants.
And it's getting close to 11 o'clock and the time that we open up the band for feedback from anybody who cares to give it on 147 475. So what can I play to play us out? Perhaps this. Quality is not good, But this is Henry Cass of the DeForest Phono Film Company introducing the very first showing of phono films anywhere in the world, in the United States, in February 1923. He explaining how the system works and what they expect to do with it.
For many years, the dawn of successful talking moving pictures has apparently been near. It seems simple enough. Just take a phonograph record and a moving picture film and keep them in synchronism, as the engineers call it. But paradoxically, in this very simplicity lay the greatest difficulty. Films are bound to break, and thus the picture becomes shorter and shorter, while the sound record retains its original length. So for many years, the apparently simple problem was an unanswerable riddle. You are now listening to a talking moving picture whose synchronism is not only perfect, but foolproof. It is the invention of Dr. Lee DeForest, the noted scientist, tube without which we would have neither radio nor transcontinental telephony. Dr. DeForest plays an entirely original task. He photographed the voice on the same film right beside the picture, and for the voice reproduction, he applied the principles of radio, a subject in which he is eminently qualified. Here is a piece of Dr. DeForest film. It is exactly the same as an ordinary moving picture film, with one exception. That is the margin here, which contains a series of horizontal lines of various widths and spacing. That is the voice record. Thus we have a talking picture in the literal sense of the word. There is no phonograph, no separation of the voice and picture. The film itself actually reproduces both. This, to which you are now listening, does more than synchronize the voice with the action. It synchronizes the voice with lip movements. I shall now pronounce the words pyrotechnic. The sound and accent, as you hear them, correspond exactly to the motion of my lips. Now observe closely while I repeat it. Pyrotechnic. When a DeForest film needs repair due to breakage, or if it is desired to eliminate any part or parts of the picture, it can be done in exactly the same manner as would be employed with an ordinary moving picture film, without affecting the synchronism of voice and action in the subsequent footage, and without makeshift adjustments of any kind. This is the difference between the DeForest talking moving pictures and all others. This is what makes it practical for everyday use. This talking moving picture can be shown under daylight conditions with a portable equipment that can be readily transported from place to place, and which can be operated by anybody who can operate a moving picture projector and a radio set. It can be shown in stores, display rooms, offices, factories, in fact most anywhere. As a medium for attracting crowds to store windows or booths at expositions, fairs, and the like, it has no equal. Having explained to you the practicability of the DeForest talking moving picture, let me now point out its significance to commercial organizations. Testimonial advertising can be made to come to life. Products can be shown in the home, conveying a home-like atmosphere, and an actual user of the product can be seen and heard recommending it.
And trust the Americans to be pushing the commercial side. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. It's 11:02 p.m. So at the moment we'll open up 147 475 for anybody who'd like to call in for a chat, as we usually do. We've been listening to VK3AML testing with material related to the work of Dr. Lee DeForest, the pioneer of the invention of the triode amplifying valve, and more significantly, probably, although less well known, a pioneer of talking pictures and optical sound film, including in Australia. The oldest Australian sound film surviving is of the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of York at Farm Cove in Sydney, shot by a DeForest crew with a DeForest camera in May 1927. So, let's see who's about on 147.475. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima standing by for any calls.
Yeah, VK3ACZ.
And VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Got you both. VK3ACZ, Peter, and VK3ECG, and I think that's Dave, unless I'm mistaken. And apologies for the stream if you've been watching there. It's been going on, off, on, off, on, off. I think the audio is a little bit more continuous than the video has been, which at least is a compensation. It buffers better. But we've had only 6 or 7 viewers tonight, which indicates to me that the quality has been a little bit down for whatever reason. So we'll take Peter first. Thank you both for coming back. With a pause in case anybody else would like to break in. VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Yeah, nothing else heard. Good evening, Chris, and good evening, David, 3ECG. Haha, I won't forget that call sign in a hurry. And yes, thank you for a great broadcast tonight, Chris. I hope all is well with you. I didn't worry about the stream because, I mean, you're 50 over 9 here on 147.475, so I don't need to worry about too much else. And I heard you were having difficulties, so I didn't worry about it. Well, DeForest, flawed genius, question mark. I noticed that lady didn't write down the details. That was a bit of a scathing endorsement of sorts for the introduction. And by the way, I agree with you about the This Is Your Life segment. That was starting to get a little bit too syrupy, and you know, the eyes were beginning to glaze over, so thank you about pausing that where you did. But very interesting broadcast all the same, and you don't have to impress us with electronics matters, but I guess it's a good thing to do occasionally, you know, because we're all amateurs and we're supposed to be into that sort of stuff. Hi. All your broadcasts, you know, I don't think I can remember you bringing up a subject that didn't interest me in some way or other, but it was good to get back into the field of electronics. So thank you for that. Anyway, I'll put it back to you for this over, and you can say good evening to David again. VK3AML and the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML. Well, it's interesting from my own point of view to listen back to one of my broadcasts from 43 years ago. I'd used the access radio station set up by Moss Cass back in 1975, 3ZZ access radio set up under the ABC, plus the advent of 3CR the next year, 1976, as a stepping stone into that sort of work. Starting off making extremely poor programs and progressing a bit, I hope, by the end of by 1978 when I did that. I had in the interim, the latter half of 1977, spent on Flinders Island as a hippie sort of thing. Never into drugs, but I was certainly into the subsistence farm lifestyle for a while at a place called Lady Barron at the southern end of Flinders Island in 77. So there was a gap between my voluntary work and my professional work in radio, and that sound film doco was a better part of 12 months' work with the ABC, 3 parts, 45 minutes a program, and lots of different usually very elderly interviewees for it, many of whom had not been involved with film for 50 years. Some of them not involved with film for 50 years because of the onset of the talking picture. Okay, across to Dave, VK3ECG. Steve Langley has given me a bit of your background, Dave, and I note that you were a large part of encouraging him to get his ham licence. I tried many years ago, but I think you gave him the final push, and I have an idea you might have let him borrow some equipment to start him off, which is great from our point of view. Steve has been a very much a positive, I think, in most amateurs' life and our family life here as well. So across to you, Dave, VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, fine, Chris. Yes, I think that's probably true, actually, and I think he might have 1 or 2 odd bits of equipment still. But he's welcome to them. Yes, and I remember sorting out, I think when he first put that antenna up in the tree in the front yard and having problems with balance and things like that, which was interesting. And of course some of the fascinating film nights when the kids were much younger than they are now. But there we are. Yes, it is funny when one sort of thinks back to what was going on. I was fascinated to hear the "This Is Your Life" as I commented. I remember as a child seeing Eamon Andrews, the Irish broadcaster who ran "This Is Your Life" in the UK, and in fact he was the chair of the Irish Television or Radio Authority when they introduced television into Ireland, actually. But he, I think the first program they did of "This Is Your Life" in the UK, he was going to, I can't remember who the host was going to be, but it got leaked by one of the daily papers prior to it happening, and so that sort of scotched the first show, and then the first one was broadcast, and it was actually him that they chose, to his surprise, as the person. So the producers had done a lot of work behind the scenes, and I think he was actually the first of the victims of the show. But he had a much more sort of that slightly cheeky sort of Irish approach to the interviews and so on. And although I suspect it was still a bit sickly sweet, it certainly had a little bit of the Irish charm about it, which was really nice. Actually, I was fascinated with the triodes and so on. There's quite a few interesting YouTube videos out about people making valves and actually blowing the glass and actually putting the bits and pieces in, and it's actually quite interesting to see how sort of amateurs are doing it on the odd occasion, as well as being some wonderful videos of the old Mullard factories and of course the modern Chinese factories making them still today, which is always fascinating to see. Anyway, back to you then, VK3 AML from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
No worries, Dave. Do we have any other breakers who'd like to join us for a chat? VK3AML. Nothing heard here. Yeah, Eamon Andrews I've seen on occasions from British television, the old 405 line. And as you say, I think the British, as a general rule, have a greater sense of irony and self-deprecation than the Americans, perhaps. And notably, I had to take the scissors to that version of This Is Your Life to remove cigarette advertisements and advertisements for some sort of mouthwash, probably intended for using after the application of the cigarette. I don't know. But, the very intrusive advertisements in the American case, I suspect the British would be a little bit more subtle. But you're right, it was a sickly sweet, non-critical look at DeForest. In fact, I had an interview, which I may play on a subsequent week, of an old co-worker with DeForest who said that he was a nice guy if you were working with him, as long as if you came up with ideas for him, persuade him that they came from him and you'd be on the right side of him. He had an immense ego, referred to himself as a genius many times. There is a notable film clip of him. He was asked to participate in a film on the history of radio, and he would only do it if they would show him sending a telegram to Congress criticising them for the amount of commercialism in radio and saying, "What have you done to my child?" which I think is an incredibly egotistical thing to say, virtually wiping the input of any other person to wireless communication, Marconi, Tesla, you name it. So while he pushed a lot of ideas, and he certainly was forward-looking with talking pictures at a time when absolutely nobody else was interested in them, and as a result of that, we have now sound films of all sorts of people who wouldn't have otherwise been filmed. I'm just looking through a list here in a book written by a professor at the University of Indiana, Harry Goddard, and he lists, let's see here, full range of phonofilm short subjects is too vast to recount anywhere. It included a variety of entertainment for all tastes, grand opera, scenes from Lacme, Rigoletto and Lucia de Lammermoor, Pavlova and Fokina, each in a separate swan dance, various numbers played by the bands of Roger Wolf Kahn, Ben Burney, Paul Specht, xylophonist Taddy Brown, Helen Lewis with her all-girl orchestra, Clyde Dorr with his saxophone sextet, a short speech by Bernard Shaw anticipating his more sensational movie tone appearance of 1928, Chauncey Depew giving his personal recollections of Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Markham, who was also very aged at the time, reading Lincoln the Man of the People, DeWolf Hopper reciting his own Casey at the Bat, Munro Silver, Cone on the Telephone, Elsa Lanchester's first sound film, Fanny Ward wisecracking, it goes on and on and on. And in spite of making all of those films, he never managed to get a buyer for the system. Nobody was interested in talking pictures. Until Warner Brothers got one Al Jolson into the studio, and the rest is history. VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML.
Yeah, just left a bit of a pause there, nothing heard. VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Oh, Chris, I forgot to mention too your description of the fall you had, and so glad you didn't hurt yourself and that the camera landed on your skinny guts. Not your words, but your meaning, I think. So all good in the end. Hopefully nothing more was dented than your pride. But not good the way these things suddenly come upon us. Yeah, and I meant to jot down the bit there about, talking pictures will never work. That's got to be one of the famous quotes of all time. Hi, hi. And, to David, as a professor of medicine, you might be interested, almost changing the subject, but not quite. Chris did play some audio recording of Florence Nightingale. Yes, the Florence Nightingale. And since she died in 1910, I was particularly thrilled to hear the sound of her voice coming across the airwaves as if she was still here. And if you ask him nicely, if you're interested, maybe he might play that again sometime. I know I wouldn't mind hearing it. I was pretty inspired by that. But anyway, just a short over this time. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML from VK3ACZ in the group.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of anybody else who was notable in medicine. Howard Florey, somewhere I have a lecture by him, recorded on an early sound film, round about the time when sound came in. Some scientists and engineers were filmed with an idea of promoting sound film as an educational medium. And one of the people filmed in that way was Lawrence Bragg, who, apart from the fact, was a brilliant crystallographer and an early atomic scientist. In the 1890s in Adelaide, had set up probably Adelaide's first demonstration of wireless telegraphy at the South Australian Museum in 1897. So there are quite a number of scientists, medical people preserved on sound film. In the psychiatric area, I've got somewhere a long lecture by Freud and another one by, I'll think of his name. It'll come to me eventually. The Freud recording is somewhat indistinct because Freud had mouth cancer, I think, towards the end of his life, and was fitted with a mouth prosthesis, which made it difficult for him to speak, particularly in English, with a thick German accent. He was forced out of Nazi Germany, considered to be, because of his Jewish connections, an Untermensch. Frightening thing to have been born in Germany at a time when the Nazis were coming to power. It must have been an immense exodus of hugely talented people all over the world. Albert Einstein, Freud, you name it. And some former Nazis actually continued their work elsewhere. They were too valuable to overlook. Werner von Braun. I send them up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun, with regard to the V2s. VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and VK3ACZ. This is VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, fine, Chris. Yes, there's some fascinating people out there. It would be certainly interesting to hear the Florence Nightingale thing, and it's interesting how she considers herself to be a complete failure in what happened in Crimea, but really a lot of her ongoing work then sort of redefined what happened in sort of medical epidemiology, and really sort of looked at critically at the way clusters and groups of patients were managed, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I gather she took to her bed and did most of her work not out in hospitals or in departments and so on, but literally at home. Sort of fascinating story. And Howard Florey is obviously fascinating from the Melbourne point of view. Some of the stuff I'm quite interested in is some of the early X-ray work and radiology work that was done, and there's some really fascinating stuff around there. Thinking about the Roentgen, and in 1895 discovering, exactly discover X-rays, but he certainly sort of clarified what they were and what they were doing, and then there's a variety of other people who took that up. Arthur Schuster, I think, Manchester. I think he did probably one of the first forensic sort of investigations of somebody who had apparently possibly been shot, but it involved taking large numbers of batteries, I think, up to her bedroom in order to get the X-ray equipment to work, since there was no grid or power supply to houses. I think that was in that would have been 1890s, late 1890s, something of that order. And there's some great sort of quotes. I came across this wonderful one I had to get out from the Scottish Medical Journal of 1897, Dr. Edward Reed, who described passage of the rays for an hour through the head of a laboratory boy of medium intelligence did not, in my hands, cause deterioration or improvement thereof. I think it's a rather nice quote. I'm not sure one could get away with that sort of thing today. VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3ECG, VK3AML. It's a very interesting subject you raise, and my predecessor with my call sign, Tony Sanderson, had two very talented children, one of which has become a radiologist. Andrew Sanderson, who's now up in Sydney. And he did a thesis, I think, examining the early days of X-ray technology and the amount of damage that was done and the sort of damage that was done using variable EHT supplies such as you get from Rumkov coils, from spark coils, powering cold cathode X-ray tubes as they had for the first 20 years, I think, before the Coolidge tube came along. Could have been 30 years. One of the books that Tony was awarded when he was Dux of sixth form in Caulfield Grammar back around 1960 was a book that I also cut my teeth on called The Boy Electrician by Alfred P. Morgan. And it was a classic text. It's like the original dangerous electrical book for boys. It was first published in 1913 and last published in about 1952. And I've got it open in front of me. I'll hold it up to the camera. And in it is a project that I started to build, but my parents stopped me building. And that was my own personal X-ray machine. It shows you exactly how to do it in this book called The Boy Electrician. Most young experimenters are unaware what a wonderful and interesting field is open to the possessor of a small X-ray tube. Small X-ray tubes will work satisfactorily on an inch or an inch and a half spark coil, which may be obtained from several electrical supply houses. They usually cost about 20 shillings or so. With such a tube and a fluoroscope, it's possible to see the bones in your own hand, the contents of a closed purse, etc. And then they go on to say, when it's desired to inspect any object such as the hand, it must be held close to the screen of the fluoroscope. It's a fluorescent screen that glows in the X-ray beam, and placed between the latter and the tube in the path of the X-rays. The X-rays are thrown forth from the tube at an angle of 45 degrees from the diagonal anode. Look into the fluoroscope and it should appear to be filled with nice green light. If not, the battery terminals connected to the primary of the coil should be reversed so as to send the current through in the opposite direction. The X-rays will cause the chemicals in the screen to light up and give forth their peculiar green light. And then they recommend no longer exposure of the hand than 8 minutes. And if you develop sores, which presumably is the preliminary onset of X-ray burns before the cancer sets in, they recommend rubbing with petroleum jelly. Thank God I didn't build it. VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Yeah, all this talk about X-rays is making me a bit queasy. I'm remembering my first year in nursing. It's my recollection that the Royal Melbourne had just been purchased their first CAT scanner. And we were reminded it cost $1 million. This is in 1977 money, and of course that the hospital's budget was $1 million a week in those days, so it was no insignificant sum. And with nothing but a lead apron, I used to hold people that wouldn't sit still. Clearly in the days before they worked out how to strap them down properly and all that, and I just cringe now when I think of how much radiation I was exposed to, and wished I hadn't. But anyway, I've made it a few years hence, so who knows. But just to get off subject for a moment, Chris, a couple of things I did want to pass on to you. Sorry about changing tack. But club meeting on Monday night will be on air on RHA Repeater again. We had our first little tryout at the new digs in Boronia, the Wesleyan Methodist Church. For Jim and Greg were running an exam, so I hope they found that the facilities were suitable for all concerned, and our first meeting will be the first Monday of the month, which I think is the 5th, don't quote me, but thereabouts anyway, first Monday of next month. So that's a bit of housekeeping out of the way to pass on to you. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
The carrier there, would you care to chime in, or do you just want to sit on the side, or what? VK3AML for the QRZ station. Do you want to join us, or are you just dropping carriers? VK3AML. Fortunately, it's a fairly weak signal, but I could hear somebody heavy breathing. Do it again. What are you wearing? Tell me more. That's the best way to deal with heavy breathers. Anyway, yeah, glad to hear that the new meeting rooms for the Sherbrooke Radio Club are working out well, Peter, and I hope to be able to present the videos of the Deal Island expedition, which include lots of views of Steve Langley on our trip. Steve, you can imagine, with the shut-in again over the last month or so, has had to go back for a significant period to teaching by Zoom, which is not easy to do with music teaching. And having 5 children must be a real juggling job, I must say. But I heard the very interesting program with him and his niece EO last night, Dave. Don't know whether you were there. I usually have to get to bed by about 12:30. And being a married man, my wife is only understanding to a certain point with ham radio. She feels neglected if I leave it much beyond about 12:30. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, I do know what you mean. I've been trying to reorganise my sort of shack into one of the bedrooms, and so it's taken a lot of fiddling around with wiring and trying to get nice speakers set up and things like that, and multiple rigs going through multiple speakers. It's a simple problem, but it takes time to fiddle and sort all these things out. But yes, I do recall those days with the lead aprons, Peter, and having to, as you say, hold people in various positions. Again, it was one of the roles of medical students to do quite a lot of this sort of thing as well from time to time, being the general handmaiden for lots of processes that go on. But yeah, we're very fortunate actually in my workplace. We're one of the few centres around that actually has CT scanners and we've just recently been funded for our own MRI, which is pretty impressive for a non-radiological service and not a hospital service. But they're absolutely fascinating. And some of the history of you know, CTs and so on is amazing, really, when you think about it. There's a lot of talk about you know, EMI developing the first of the scanners, and in fact people claiming that you know, it was the Prophets and the Beatles that funded CT scanners. I don't think that actually is true, despite it being quoted multiple times. But it is certainly interesting that the initial idea was that they thought there'd probably be a worldwide need for about half a dozen to a dozen CT scanners, and so EMI's investment wasn't particularly very major at the beginning. I think there's probably more CT scanners per head of population in Japan than anywhere else in the world now, but we're talking about millions of scanners, and it's extraordinary. There's still only about 4 or 5 companies that really make them, and but it's yeah, it is quite a fascinating history, and I think Jeffrey Hansfeld, you know, got kosher slaughterhouse cow's brain machines and put them in this box, and he sketched out some of his original designs in the 60s on a napkin at a picnic or something, where he worked out at least the ideas of what would happen in a commercial clinical scanner. And there were other people who, as so often occurs with sort of inventions like this, a lot of other people coming up with the same sort of ideas around the same time, people from US and South Africa and so on. So there was a sort of coalition of sort of ideas, I think, that sort of culminated in the scanner. And then, well, when I was at medical school, interestingly, I was at Nottingham, and that was one of the places where a lot of work on the early MRI was done. I remember going to a public lecture where the first sort of MRI they had produced in Nottingham on their scanner, they had just managed to get one person's finger into the scanner and just show a very, very grainy MRI scan of somebody's index finger, and that was as big as they could go in those days. It's extraordinary now, and now you have ultra high resolution CTs that are used a lot in manufacturing and in engineering, actually, to look at defects in metal and things like this, and quite extraordinary pieces of equipment, and almost down to the cellular level, and that you can actually see body tissues quite specifically in some of these really super high resolution micro scanners. Amazing stuff. Anyway, back to you. VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, no worries, Dave. Just before going any further, I believe that you were involved with forensics. Are you still doing that sort of work?
Yeah, that's right. So we're involved in the sort of forensic side of those things, and as I said, that's why a lot of the radiology now is beginning to really have a big impact on that. In fact, some of the very early CT scans involved with forensic work. There was a famous case in Manchester, I think it was in the 1890s again, where, as I said, this person was supposed to have been shot, and they wheeled all these batteries upstairs to have a look and see what was going on in this poor lady, who eventually died. There again, that's the way of the work we do. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yes, I'll just check. Do we have any other breakers there who'd like to join us? VK3AML, standing by. No, sounds like everybody's gone to bed. And incidentally, the stream is going much better now. It's down to 4% drop frames from initial 12 or 13%. So I would say, because I haven't touched anything here, that this is an internet load issue on Saturday nights. And I'm running 1080p tonight. Next week I shall run 720 just to see if I can get it with a bit less buffer underrun, because certainly the first two times I came on just at 9:30 we just lost the stream entirely twice. So the first 15 minutes of this transmission were basically lost as far as YouTube goes. Continuing now though. Yeah, just getting back to the X-ray stuff, Dave. Years ago, I'm talking 45 years ago, I was probably as interested in radio history then as I am now. And on an intermediary's suggestion, apparently, I got a phone call at about 8 o'clock one night, this would have been about 1976 or thereabouts, from an old bloke who was curious to know what I had in the way of notes on the Wireless Institute, not from the 20s, but from before the First World War, and he introduced himself as Wallace K. Witt, Wally Witt, and I subsequently met him. He was in his 90s in 1976. And he told me that he had started his electrical work as an assistant to a very early radiologist in Melbourne named Dr. Clendinnen, who I think was one of the first to take X-rays in Melbourne. He told me that Clendinan's hands had been badly affected by the overuse of X-rays with a fluoroscope, and that by the time he became his assistant in 1910, he had to manipulate all of the gear that they had because Clendinan's hands no longer would work properly. One of those early casualties of X-ray usage that nobody could have predicted. I don't think anybody knew about the potential damage of radiation at that stage. Certainly Marie Curie eventually died of cancer, probably brought on by her exposure to radium in her early work purifying from pitchblende. He told me a very sad story that eventually Clendinan had had a series of amputations of fingers, and gosh, talk about a compassionate man going that way. Early X-ray really was a hazardous occupation, although Wally lived to a great age, abused himself quite a bit. Every time I met him, up to the time of his death in about 1978, he was smoking a very large cigar, and apparently he'd started smoking at 16 and he managed to make it to 97. Anyway, round to Peter, VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML on the group from VK3ACZ. Yeah, there are always stories like that where people break the conventions or work against the how things are supposed to work. I remember interviewing a 99-year-old man who'd been gassed and bombed in the First World War at Polygon Wood, and he'd made it to 99 with a heart defect that was supposed to kill him in his 20s, and all I could think was, how good would he have been if he'd not been gassed and bombed? You know, how far past 100 would he have got? But anyway, still on the subject of big cigars and all that, you mentioned Freud before, and to show how little I knew about the so-called father of modern psychiatry or psychoanalysis or whatever his claim to fame is, I didn't realise he even spoke English. I naturally assumed he would only be German. So if at any stage you can, if you'd like to share that bit of sound footage, that would be very welcome from this side there, just as a suggestion. Anyway, back to you, Chris, VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, no worries. Easily done. I can't do it tonight. I'd have to search through the computer to find out where I put it. One of the problems of having computers with terabyte memories, I've got 9 2 terabyte storage systems here with all sorts of stuff on them. Films, sound recordings, photographs, video that I've shot, that other people have shot. And the hardest thing is actually remembering what you filed the file under. Needless to say, Freud, but what I would have to do is to pull out each of those 9-odd terabyte drives and keep plugging them in until I found one with the Freud file. I easily done, just a bit fiddly. Just back onto the X-rays again, Dave, 380CG. The other area in which X-rays cross with radio quite a bit is in that First World War, pre-First War period, when radio gear really consisted of little more than a tuned circuit with a spark coil and a coherer. The same sort of equipment exactly that you used for producing X-rays, high voltage spark coil with a trembler gap on the end, was used for either radio or for X-rays. I know that quite a few early amateurs were using the spark coil out of a T-model Ford, which had a buzzer interrupter on one end of the coil, which is probably the reason that T-model Fords used to backfire a lot. But G.W. Selby, after Clendinan, I think was the second person to take X-rays in Melbourne. I met his son, David Selby, back about 1973, and subsequently I being a hoarder of information, I wrote to him, and he wrote back with photostats of some of his father's stuff. Selby had a big house, two-storey Victorian mansion in Alma Road, Caulfield, near Dandenong Road. Long gone now. It was demolished in the 50s. And it was one of those huge houses that required servants to make it viable, because manpower required to keep it clean and keep the meals up and all the rest. And Selby, as a business, had a series of nurseries in the Dandenong Ranges, needless to say, at Selby, which was named after his family. Anyway, Selby got into electrical experimentation in the late 1870s, static electricity machines and all that sort of stuff, electrophoresis, all of that, and made himself a very early generator about 1880. And then in the early 1890s he acquired a spark coil for high voltage experiments, which with a big spark coil such as he had could be quite spectacular. Things like Jablikoff's candles and corona discharge effects and all that sort of stuff, and lighting up Geissler tubes, gas discharge tubes of various types. That he had a Crookes tube, and he read about the Rontgen experiments in 1896 and almost immediately connected his Crookes tube up, got a plate holder out of a camera, stuck a plate on the inside the plate holder with the X-ray tube, or the Crookes tube I should say, running off his spark coil, and he managed to find a dead rat in his basement and stuck it on the plate holder and got a perfect X-ray of the dead rat. And some 80 years later he gave me a copy, his son gave me a copy, which I still have, and I think that was taken in the earliest months of 1897, which goes back a hell of a long way. But oh, how much danger those people were exposing themselves to, unwittingly. VK3CG and group VK3AML.
Yep, VK3AML and VK3ACZ, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. You're absolutely right. Yes, so extraordinary. That's a wonderful story about Selby. I'd be very keen to see the picture of the rat if you do have it. It would be a fascinating thing to. I could easily drop that into the odd talk here and there with appropriate acknowledgements, of course. That would be certainly very interesting, because we're very heavily involved these days in sort of introduction of radiology generally and CT scan in particular into sort of my work, and we're doing a lot of sort of teaching and exploration of those things. But you're absolutely right. I was thinking back to your boy electrician article. There was something I saw on someone using an RCA valve, running it in cold cathode mode and putting 20 kilovolts on it, and apparently you couldn't force even a valve like that into being a reasonable X-ray source, which again begs the question of shielding and so on. Of course, at 20 kV it's probably not that dire, as the penetration and energy levels are probably quite low, but when we're talking about 30, 70, 100 kilovolts, and that you certainly get quite a bit there. And you do get quite a lot more exposure on a CT than you do on plain films. But certainly in my early days in practice, certainly in the forensic fields, we were using fluoroscopy a lot, and only taking the actual the X-ray film, and it was film in those days, when we had the right image that we wanted. So we would localize everything using fluoroscopes, and they're still around. I mean, they're not so much used these days, but I used portable fluoroscopy as well when working overseas in various things, looking for projectiles and things like that. So yeah, they're certainly still around and still useful, although you we're going to be manipulating things in front of the screen, then there are these big, heavy sort of lead-lined gloves that you're supposed to wear, and we did, thank goodness. But they're a bit like the sort of thick, heavy gloves you use to take things out of liquid nitrogen and so on. Yeah, absolutely really nasty, and loss of hair. A lot of the early people used to lose hair on their hands. They get this really quite nasty dermatitis, which was basically a destructive process. X-rays and ionizing radiation being particularly active against anything that's an actively dividing cell type, and of course the skin's a good example of that, and hair and so on. So yeah, really quite nasty things, but I would certainly be very interested if you have a picture of one of those very early X-rays, particularly one taken in Melbourne. So that would be absolutely fascinating. Back to you, VK3AML and Group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3ECG and Group VK3AML. Yeah, I have that. If it's of interest, I also have a very clear 10 by 8 taken from a half-plate negative that I found when I was working at the Queen Vic Museum in Launceston. Taken by an experimenter in about 1898, showing a complete X-ray outfit. The tube, the wooden clamp, the spark coil, which was a big thing, about 18 inches long and at least 12-inch diameter. And wet cell batteries in a kind of a bank. I think we worked out from the wet cells, the number there, that was a 9-volt, fairly heavy current input on the low voltage side. And the photo was taken by an architect who was an experimenter in all things photographic named A.H. Masters, who was based in Launceston. But yeah, it's a very clear photo of how the X-rays were taken. The best one I've seen, actually. And young Andrew Sanderson, when I say young, he's now, pushing 40. I shouldn't call him young. I've seen him from infancy. But Andrew Sanderson used that photograph in his thesis on my suggestion. It's just one that I came across when I was down there. I did about 2 years' worth of work in Tasmania on a history of landscape photography there. Photography is another one of my interests, although everything that I learned about developing photographs and chemicals and speed slowing fine-grained neg developers is now all completely obsolete. Can't use any of it. Threw out all my developing tanks, threw out all of my film cameras and gave them away. Couldn't see the point of them anymore. And now I take them so much more easily with electronic cameras, digital cameras. And I don't have to put up with breathing all of those fumes in the darkroom. I don't know what it was about ammonium thiosulfate, but it always left me feeling irritated and tetchy the next morning. A bit like having a hangover, but chemically induced. You ever into photography, Peter? I mean, you know, not just taking photographs, but actually developing them. Have you ever got into that? VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. No, I can't say that I have. My interest in photography was night photos. Love taking long exposures with slow film, 4 to 8 minute exposures at f8 or higher. Walk into the photo, use the flash gun to illuminate shadows. Make sure you don't stand still or you'd come out in the shot as a ghost figure. But I used to impress people with blowing up a large Kodachrome 25 or 64 slide and saying, "Oh, see that over there? I walked right through that and you wouldn't know I was there." But no, definitely not the developing. Back on the subject of X-rays and all that, and I guess I don't have an awful lot to contribute, but I wish I had the paranoia that I have now when I was in my younger days, as I said, as a young student nurse who didn't know any better. And the paranoia probably extends to things like bone scans as well now, and all forms of nuclear medicine. I recall in 1982 I had to do a patient escort, a little 4-year-old boy who was, his dad was from Vietnam, had been in Vietnam, so it was Agent Orange, and the kid had to have a bone scan, and would you believe the Children's Hospital couldn't do that in those days. The escort I did was to the nuclear medicine department at St. V's. And I remember when the radiopharmaceutical was injected into the boy's arm, they took the needle away and some started to flow out. So without thinking, I just quickly put my thumb over the top of the injection site. And you would have thought the Third World War had broken out because it was, you've been contaminated. And next thing they had this stuff like shaving cream that I had to scrub my thumb with for a while, and then I had to stick my thumb in a little machine with one of those old orange forerunners to the LED, number display things, and they said, you're all right, you haven't been contaminated or exposed. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, you're going paranoid about my exposure on the end of my thumb. What have you just injected into that kid? So, hence my being a little bit paranoid about all that stuff ever since, and I don't have to think about Madame Curie to get a little bit nervous. But anyway, that's forgetting all the wonderful good that the incredible invention has done. And I marvel at the way the technology has improved in the last few years. Oh, and one other comment, Chris, you asked Dave about his professional capacity, and I was just thinking neither of us are in a hurry to meet David in a professional capacity. Hi. Yes, we'd like to meet you at a Hamfest or similar, but we definitely don't want to meet you while you're working. Hi. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, I've actually met Dave. Occasionally our mutual friend Steve, VK3SL, has film nights outdoors in summer projected up against his garage door, which is white and featureless, until a film of Harold Lloyd gets projected on it. So that's how I've met Dave. VK3CG to take, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and VK3ACZ, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, indeed. I haven't been to one of those for quite a few years, actually. But yes, I used to go to quite a few of them, and always great fun fighting with the bench space with kids, and endless running around of crisps and various other goodies. Although I must say, Kate used to try to improve the quality of the nutrition on occasions at these things. But yes, it was fascinating, and I love some of those films. I particularly like the Everest film that I think he showed on one occasion, that early expedition, which was silent again, but absolutely fascinating, from the British Archives, I think. Really great fun. Yes, with the photography side, I know exactly what you mean, and it's interesting, looking at not only has the digital taken over all of the sort of old film-based photography for the most part, although it's a little bit of a resurgence I've noticed in the last few years. But it's the same thing as in the X-rays, because of course people would have, there were huge stocks of old X-ray films at all the hospitals, and eventually these were sent for silver reclamation. For a while people would make copies, and occasionally digital copies were made, but for the most part all those old X-rays just went by the by, and were eventually destroyed after X number of years. And of course it's just completely changed now, so I don't think we've even got any wet film processing available to us now, and I suspect that very few departments would have those, except in some sort of dusty basement where, yes, perhaps you'd find a rat. But the silver reclamation was the big thing, and all of that has gone. There's really very little of that sort of technology left in medicine, and the digital stuff has just become so extraordinary. I was talking to one of my radiology colleagues, and he was saying, the biggest users of Telstra and Optus and other companies and so on, and communications companies, is in fact the radiology. They're bigger overall in terms of data traffic than almost any other commercial discipline or private industry in the country, and that's probably true across the world because so much radiology now is delivered remotely, and it involves moving huge amounts of data across the internet, and even to the extent that companies will send half their radiologists to the other hemisphere so that those radiologists can work there for 6 months and they do the nighttime work, and then the people at home base do the daytime work. It's just and it's just as easy. You can sit and do your work in the northern hemisphere during the southern hemisphere's night just as easily, and it's a quite efficient way of delivering services. It does make some regulation issues a little bit complicated though. Back to you. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Before we hand it round, Dave, I'd be curious if you could give me a description, if you know, of exactly what they put underneath you to detect the X-rays instead of film these days. Now, I've seen them put some sort of an electronic sensor about 10 inches by 8 under me whenever they've been doing things like scanning lower back. I had some problems. And it obviously had some wires coming out of it, and I presume it was some sort of charged couple device. But how exactly does it work? Do they couple the charged couple device, the scanner, somehow into a scintillation crystal, or do you know?
I'm not really up on the physics of that. Some of them, I think the early ones did use some sort of chemical thing, but these days they're really tiny devices. You can even have the intraoral ones as well, essentially the plate is just basically read in a sort of scanner reader device, and that's scanned, and the image is then collected off that. So, but I don't know the details of how they work. I can find out though from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear exactly how that functions. I mean, as you may have gathered from the interest in light beam communication that I have, I'm always interested in ways low-level light is detected, and in scintillation counters, for example, they use photomultipliers, or used, past tense, photomultipliers with very large crystals of various materials, usually cemented to the photocathode of the photomultiplier with petroleum jelly or some sort of high refractive index material to couple the crystal to the photocathode so that any scintillations are counted, I suppose, by the photomultiplier and associated circuitry for radiation counting at low levels. But I just don't know exactly the physics of X-ray scanning as it's now done. And I know that they can do wonderful stuff now in relieving cancers that can be treated with radiation. My friend Mike 7MJ is suffering from prostate cancer at the moment, which they've caught early, fortunately, but apparently they put you into some sort of a big barrel arrangement with rays into your body that are very carefully regulated, and the rays are switched off or masked off as the rotating source goes past your spine. So compared to cancer treatment back in the 60s, it's really sophisticated and spot on these days. Very little in the way of collateral radiation damage. It's an interesting world we live in. I say this to both of you. I'm finding the boundaries of amateur radio, for example, at the moment, very interesting as we get into digital communication, digital imaging. The streaming we're doing tonight, it would not have been possible 5 years ago, particularly not with a little camera that costs $110 and produces ultra-high definition results. So I hope to live another couple of decades, optimistically, so that I can see where this is all going. VK3ACZ, VK3AML. It's an exciting time to be alive, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I could go along with that. VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Sandra has a relative who's a radiographer. I could inquire and get back to you in a few days about how it works now with the modern signal processing and all that sort of stuff. In fact, I'd never really given it much of a thought myself. Yeah, all's good there. I might make this my finals. It's getting rather late, and I've had a busy week on amateur radio. I started by needing to go up the hill portable as soon as we got let out of lockup. Of course, the storm put a dent on that. The constabulary were blocking the road up to my favourite spot up at Olinda, where I like to go, where it's super quiet. And I found a new little spot in Belgrave Heights, which is absolutely wonderful. But I've just had this amazing time all week. 20 metres has been great. I had 2 consecutive days on 40. I went long path to Spain. I spoke to the same fellow. I don't know whether he's an expat. I was too polite to ask, but with a Yorkshire accent, but he was living in Valencia in Spain. Spoke to him 2 days running. No pile-ups. Nobody else in Australia could hear him. It was only me, and 5-7 both ways. I had a 1 hour rag chew on 20 metres with a fellow in Edmonton, Canada, in the middle of the week. 5 9s both ways. That was a lot of fun. I've just been having a ball. This afternoon, I went to the US short path a couple of times and topped it off with VK0PD Paul down at Casey Station, where he informed me it was minus 18 degrees at the moment, and mind you, where I was out portable, it didn't feel much warmer. But anyway, funny thing was, he said, I guess it's getting close to dark for you now, and I said, yeah, the sun's just going down. You're further around, it'll still be daylight there. And then I realised, oh no, it's probably dark all the time, and he confirmed, yes, there's just the glow of yellow orange light on the horizon looking out to sea. So that was all pretty good. But anyway, yeah, I must get out of here. It's after the bewitching hour now, 14:05 UTC. And thank you, as always, once again for your terrific broadcast tonight, Chris. Thank you too, Dave, for your contribution to what's been a great chat between the three of us. And I'll say 7-3 to you both, and look forward to doing it all again next week. And Chris, hopefully hear you on RAJ for the club meeting on Monday. Anyway, cheers to you both, and good night. VK3 ECG in the group, VK3AML, VK3ACZ. 7-3, guys.
Yeah, 7-3s, Peter, and we'll catch up on Monday night on the air, I'm sure. And I had a phone call from young Tom, VK3FTOM, just before dinner, and he apparently has relatives up the Dandenong Ranges and was able yesterday to get up there to see them. But he tells me the devastation up there is absolutely heartbreaking. Power poles down, lots of trees down, wires still hanging off telegraph poles, houses that have become uninhabitable. I believe that there are something like 118 houses, particularly in the Dandenongs, which have become uninhabitable, and of course they become a security risk, which is why the police are being so punctilious in keeping the major roads closed, except to people with a good excuse for being there. And this has happened at the first time that I've ever wanted to go to One Tree Hill to try pedestrian mobile transmission of digital slow scan pictures. I have the tablet now to do it and the portable transmitter even a portable caravan, normally used for caravan TV antenna reception. I've got that for portable work. I can carry it in a bus, only 2 metres long, just low enough to carry in a bus. And I can take my whole station up to One Tree Hill and send photographs of where we are. But the one time I'm equipped to do it and want to do it, the police have blocked the road. Oh well, I'm sure it'll solve itself eventually. Very nice to catch up with you, Dave, and be assured that Steve 3SL has put in a good word for you and given me a bit of your background there. I having heard a bit of that background, I felt a bit self-conscious having played either last week or the week before the recording of the opening of the camps, because I understand that you have some antecedents that fell victim to all of that. VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ECG, and good night to you, Peter. Yes. Yes, that is true. Although, as I said, I do feel it's a very different generation. But the history is fascinating and very telling. And I suppose there's still wonderful artworks, and I went to a very nice concert a couple of years ago in Salzburg, where very modern work based on letters from camps and things like that. Sort of again, it's still stimulating enormous amount of questions and works artworks that try to, I suppose, pick up on the ethos of that time and the unbelievable stressors and so on that were on individuals and communities and so on and so forth. But yeah, they are really very, very challenging times. Yes, it's difficult. I mean, I almost made the mistake this morning thinking, oh, perhaps I will go up to Dandong's or something just for a walk, and then I realised this is probably not the place to go at the moment. I can't believe how lucky we were, in fact, in Warrandyte, apart from the storm branches down and things like that, but really we didn't have any power in the area that I was in. Other places in Warrandyte did lose power and so on, but only for a short time, and to hear that they are actually considering that it's not possible to repair the lines and it's almost worth rebuilding that section of the grid with some underground lines, really sort of highlights the degree of destruction that was there. I've stayed out of that. I had enough of experience driving around in 2009 with the bushfires and seeing what was going on the other areas and how difficult that was from time to time. Yeah, as for the detectors, yes, as far as I'm aware, that they're a semiconductor device that basically stores the light charge and then digitally stores that in the plate, and then that's downloaded. But I don't really understand the beyond that general bit of physics. I don't understand exactly how that's done or what the sophistication in the designs are. But yeah, there's obviously quite a lot of technology that goes into just that side of the equation, as well as the production. It's a bit like the transceiver in a vague way, I suppose. You know, everyone thinks about the transmitter, but the reality is all the clever stuff is in the receiver. And at the end of the day, a transmitter is just a transmitter, and yes, you want to reduce all your harmonics and all the other distortions and things like that, but there's far more technology in a receiver than there ever is in a transmitter, and I suspect there's a lot of other issues around that in the radiology field. But I always remember the days before CT scans really were in general clinical use, when effectively what we used to be called was tomography, and which of course CAT scans are computer-assisted tomography, but it's axial tomography. But the old tomograms used to have a static source, and then the patient would be whizzed around and rotated so that there's only one single focal point that would stay in focus with everything else being moved around. A bit like photographing in a moving sky image and things like that. And by moving the person in 3D, you would actually get one tiny spot which was actually in focus, and everything else was sort of blurred out, and allow people to hone in on a 3D object. Fascinating, but you can see these poor people being whizzed around and turned upside down all over the place in the old machines, but a lot simpler these days to do that sort of thing. Anyway, I won't hold it too much more now, Chris, and but thanks very much for this evening. A fascinating bit of history and a great chat after that. So back to you, VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3CG. Likewise, Dave, thanks very much, and to you too, Peter, if you're still listening. Just a pity that the stream didn't work as well this week. I had it on 1080p, 30 frames a second. The transfer rate is significantly lower than it was on Thursday night, for whatever reason, who knows. Maybe just people are in on a Saturday night and using it more than most other nights of the week. I will drop it back to 720p. I'm making a note of that now. Next week. With the tomography, many years ago, back about 1980, Phil, I've forgotten his second name, he worked for a medical equipment hire place, and he was in charge of servicing the equipment. And in those days, I don't know exactly how it worked, but they had some sort of a body scanner, and this would have been about 1978, where you would hold a sensor or a source, I don't know, in your hand and wave your hand over the patient, and the picture of what you were scanning inside would be built up on a storage cathode ray tube with a special storage mesh behind the fluorescent screen. He gave me the storage tube thinking I could use it for slow scan TV, but it was only a two-state tube, just on or off, didn't have shades of grey, so a fairly primitive device, and I never, getting the scan coils working at the scan rate I wanted would have been huge difficulty, so I never actually did it, and I kept the tube for about 15 years and then gave it away somewhere, I think. Either that or it broke in storage, I don't remember, but there was some very exotic equipment then, and in the old days would have been incredibly expensive, but once taken out of service, just so much spare glass, I guess. Back to you for a final, Dave, and thanks for popping up. VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yes, fine, Chris, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, absolutely. I mean, so much of this old technology has been, got rid of or is languishing in some basement until somebody decides to write it off, and very occasionally people sell off stuff, odd bits to staff and things like that, but I think that happens less and less these days. It's all taken away by some bulk auction place and so on, and as you say, a lot of it is really worthless to any sort of modern enterprise. So it'll only be people with a historical interest in or an alternative use for the technology. I can't think exactly what you're referring to. I mean, as I said, fluoroscopy was certainly something that we used, and that was, and you dynamically do things like put probes and things like that and see where the probe went, and I remember doing that in the very early days, looking for bullets in people and things like that, and you'd actually be able to advance a probe under fluoroscopic control, and then once you'd located it in a sort of taking two views and so on as a 3D spot, and move it around so you got an idea where things were. It did help you in locating things, which isn't always as easy as some people would think. But that's not really used very much these days, because with modern CT scanners, that you know exactly where things are, and it makes life an awful lot easier, actually. But there we are. fascinating times, and there's a lot. It's interesting to think about how, as you say, how the technology has changed and really completely transformed the way in which we work, and remote working really becomes, quite possible for quite a lot of the diagnostic services and things like that, as it is for a lot of electronics and computer work. A lot of it can be done remotely these days, just as effectively. And we're seeing the outcome of the pandemic and the changes in work practice that's led to has made people realise, well, actually a lot of work can go on just as efficiently. Although I like Steve, I do find teaching via Zoom, it can be interesting and challenging from time to time. Anyway, all the very best, Chris. Good night, and thank you very much for this evening. Most interesting. VK3 Echo Charlie Golf, just closing now with VK3AML. Good night, Chris.
No worries, Dave, and just something for your notebook. The best collection of early X-ray tubes that I've ever seen, going right back to 1896, Museum of Victoria, not on display, but held in their storage area. They have a terrific collection of Crookes tubes, X-ray tubes, hot cathode, cold cathode, Geissler tubes, you name it. A very, very nice collection, unfortunately rarely seen. So if you're interested in such things, you can make an appointment with a curator and see it if you so desire. They don't advertise that. Of course, it means extra work, but it is an obligation under the Act, the Museums Act. Okay, I'll take a final listen for any further breakers before closing. Anybody else want to chip in? VK3AML. Okay, with that, we'll close to have our next session next Saturday, 9:30 p.m. as usual, and that'll be a 720p transmission, not 1080. I think 1080 we've overdone it and we're getting buffer underrun. Although now it's down to 3%, which it was started off at 13%. So I think we've got a situation of the internet being sufficiently loaded on a Saturday night that it can't carry 1080p continuously. It might do 720, particularly if I reduce the frame rate from 30 to 25. And with that, I'll close the stream, and this is VK3AML.